There's this scene in The Dark Knight that always stuck with me. Joker sets fire to a mountain of cash while surrounded by Gotham's criminal elite. An entire fortune going up in flames while he just watches.
This town deserves a better class of criminals.
It's not the money that's important to him, it's the chaos. And in that moment, it's hard to look away because you realize something. The villain is the one driving the story forward, not the hero. Would The Dark Knight even work without the Joker? Would Batman's quest for justice feel as gripping if it wasn't being tested, twisted and pushed to its limits by a villain with no boundaries? We like to believe that heroes are the heart of a story, the ones we're rooting for, but let's be real for a second. It's the villains who make us care. Today I want to explore not only why villains are better than heroes, but why they're so essential. And by the end of this video, you might even catch yourself rooting for them, or understand why you always have.
Say hello to my little friend! You wanna play rough? Okay.
There's a reason we all remember the villains. It's not just because they're the bad guys, it's because they set the stakes. Imagine Star Wars without Darth Vader's looming shadow. Luke would be just some farm boy messing around with laser swords, if that. Without Vader, there's no journey, no internal struggle, no pressure for Luke to rise to the occasion. The villain creates the conflict, and the conflict creates the hero. In a completely different universe, we watch the Avengers save the world for years, quip at each other and deal with comparatively small-scale threats. But then comes Thanos, and suddenly we're in deep. He's not just some cartoonish villain twirling his mustache. He has a philosophy, a deeply disturbing but coherent worldview, and that's what makes him terrifying. He genuinely believes what he's doing is right. And you get why he's doing it. That's why watching the Avengers fall apart under his plan is almost satisfying, because it feels more like watching a philosophical battle than a regular superhero showdown. Thanos doesn't just test the hero's strength, he forces them to question their very reason for fighting. This is what separates great villains. Their ideology doesn't just challenge the hero, it makes them grow. Thanos didn't crave power for its own sake, he seeks balance, believing he was the only one willing to make the hard, brutal choices. In his mind, he wasn't the villain at all. There was a problem and he was the necessary solution no one else could accept. While the Avengers were scrambling to stop him, Thanos had already moved beyond power struggles. He was shaping the entire narrative around his vision of peace. Without him, the Avengers are just some good-looking models punching their way through generic bad guys. With Thanos, they're facing the collapse of their ideals, and they're not just fighting to stop him, they're fighting to find meaning in a world that no longer makes sense.
With all 6 stones, I could simply snap my fingers. They would all cease to exist. I call that mercy.
And then what?
I finally rest and watch the sunrise on a grateful universe. The hardest choices require the strongest wills.
In Far Cry 3 we have Vaas, someone who's unhinged, unpredictable, yet captivating. When he launches into that infamous definition of insanity monologue, you can't help but lean in. His chaotic nature throws you into uncomfortable situations that make you question your own decisions. And sure, you could argue the protagonist, Jason, grows throughout the game, but let's not kid ourselves. Vaas is the one everyone remembers. Do you even remember that he wasn't even the final baddie in Far Cry 3? I don't. All I remember after Vaas is that one scene at the end. You know the one. But overall, Vaas sets the tone, and the chaos of the game is a direct result of his influence. What would be Far Cry 3 without Vaas? Would it even be as iconic as we remember it?
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Heroes are reactive by nature. They respond to threats, try to stop disasters, and clean up the mess. But villains, they're proactive. They create the threats. They are the mess. And without that, heroes don't have much to do. Villains are the architects of conflict, and conflict isn't just the lifeblood of storytelling, It's the engine of human experience.
In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
In the show Attack on Titan, there's a character named Zeke, a soldier who spent years making a plan to achieve his ultimate goal: to end the suffering of his race by preventing them from ever having children again. It's a horrifying and brutal plan, but it's not a move driven by hatred or a lust for power. No, Zeke's plan feels more like a final, desperate solution to a problem he thinks can't be solved any other way. When I watched the show, I remember wondering if this plan was Zeke's choice at all, or was he pushed onto this path by forces he never had any control over. Yes, there's a lot of context obviously around it, but essentially it's a question that touches on the nature of free will. It's easy to label villains as evil, but the more I think about it, the more it feels like they're not choosing to be villains at all. They're just trapped. Trapped by their circumstances, by their trauma, or by a fate that was laid out for them long before they had a say in it. In Zeke's example, his twisted philosophy of saving his people is rooted in a childhood where he was used as a pawn by his own parents. His entire life has been shaped by a war that's been raging for centuries, and he has to play an active part in it. So when he hatches this horrifying plan, is it really his? Or is he just another victim of the same fate he's trying to escape? Like a cog in a machine that's been turning long before he came along, Zeke's actions feel less like choices and more like reactions to a script.
お前にしちゃ随分と安らかな死に方だろう。奪った仲間たちの命に比べてみれば。
奪ってない。救ってやったんだ。そいつらから生まれてくる命を。この残酷な世界から。
Another character whose fall to villainy feels inevitable is Darth Vader. As Anakin Skywalker, his every step towards the dark side seems already set for him. And the more he resists, the more it tightens. It's a paradox, right? The harder these characters try to escape their fate, the more they get trapped by it. And that's where the real tragedy of these villains comes in. Not that they're evil, but that they're caught in this web of destiny, pulled in directions they can't control. It's almost like they're heroes in their own stories. If we stop looking at villains as the root of the problem, we might realize they're just a symptom of something much larger than them. Like a broken world, a cycle of violence, or a history of trauma, and a lack of support when they needed it the most. The only difference between them and heroes is that while heroes strive to overcome their fate and succeed, villains often surrender to it because they have to. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that they choose villainy, but that they never had a choice to begin with.
許せ、サスケ。これで最後だ。
Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This is how Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung would describe the shadow self, the repressed primal part of our psyche that we refuse to acknowledge. And when we look at villains like the Joker, it's hard not to see that shadow staring back at us. Joker doesn't just stand for chaos, he's a reflection of the parts of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden. There's just something unsettling, even cathartic about watching him tear down Gotham's order. And maybe it's because deep down we all know how flawed the system and its rules actually are. Not that long ago we experienced this firsthand and saw how badly the world governments handled a certain situation. Villains like the Joker forces us to confront the absurdity of life, and how maybe, just maybe, that chaos feels more familiar than we would like to admit. It's as if they tap into our frustrations, into those buried impulses to rebel against society's constraints. And that's essentially Freud's id, the part of our mind that craves satisfaction without burden of consequence. Id acts according to the pleasure principle, the force oriented to immediate gratification of impulse and desire. So in a way, Joker is pure id, a manifestation of chaos without boundaries. Beyond the surface, he challenges our own sense of control. Deep down, he makes us face the uncomfortable truth of how we're all just one bad day away from letting that shadow take over.
Look at me.
Take Magneto from X-Men. On the surface, X-Men stand for unity, diversity, and the idea that differences makes us stronger. But without Magneto, there's no real conflict. He's not just a bad guy, he's the embodiment of a shadow shaped by trauma. His motives aren't rooted in evil, but in survival. Looking from the perspective of Carl Jung, we could argue that Magneto's actions reflect the shadow self fighting to protect itself, even if it means resorting to extremes. He's not just battling the X-Men, he's battling the shadow within all of us, the part willing to sacrifice morality for survival. The same often applies to characters like Walter White from Breaking Bad, where we get to witness the full story of anti-hero becoming a villain. Freud might say his ego, the part that balances morality, collapses under the weight of his id, and we're right there with him, watching his descent into villainy. At what point do we stop rooting for him? Is it when he lets Jane die, or when he poisons a child? The unsettling part is that Walter's fall doesn't just make us question him, it makes us question ourselves.
I liked it. I was good at it. And I was really I was alive.
But maybe the reason I enjoy learning more about villains than protagonists is because I'm getting older, and I can relate to the flaws and challenges of villains a lot more than white paper heroes. Heroes stand for order, for some values and stability. Cool. But villains, they get to be messy and flawed, just like I am. They hold up the mirror we don't want to look into, the one that shows us the choices we suppress, the paths we'll never take, but can't help but wonder about.
First you have to know, not fear. Know that someday you're gonna die.
You don't know how this feels.
It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything.
But that's just fiction, right? It's just a fantasy. Well, history is written by the victors, or so the saying goes. In our world's history, some of the most revered figures were also seen as villains in their time. To the French, Napoleon was a revolutionary leader, a symbol of ambition. But to his enemies, he was a warmonger who plunged Europe into chaos. This duality, where one person's hero is another's tyrant, is what makes real-life quote-unquote villains so fascinating. And fiction is often a reflection of such complex figures. Characters like Julius Caesar or Steve Jobs, depending on your perspective, are either visionary leaders or ruthless manipulators. Caesar expanded the Roman Empire, yet his thirst for power led to civil war. Steve Jobs transformed the tech industry, but stories of his treatment of employees painted a picture of a man who would do anything for success. This gray area, where ambition and morality collide, is what makes us so conflicted about these figures. They challenge us to question whether their methods were justified by their results. And often, if the result is shiny enough or makes our lives more convenient, we choose to ignore the more uncomfortable perspectives of how it all went down. The most impactful figures are rarely one-dimensional. Maybe that's why we're drawn to them. Not because we admire their actions, but because they had such strong conviction and we recognize the weight of their choices. Choices that, for better or worse, left the world changed forever.
Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards.
And speaking of forces that can change the world, in The Witcher 3, Eredin and the Wild Hunt don't just bring chaos. They're the force that makes everything move. Without them, Geralt's journey would feel almost aimless, just wandering the continent, avoiding the inevitable. It's the looming presence of the Wild Hunt that pushes Geralt to confront his past, and ultimately face decisions that are as painful as they are necessary. And that's the thing, villains don't just test a hero's strength, they challenge their philosophy. Eredin represents more than just destruction. He's the embodiment of an idea Geralt constantly fights against, and we like to use conveniently when it suits us. Fate. And no matter how hard Geralt tries to escape, Eredin forces him to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that some things can't be outrun. It's a theme we see in villains time and again, the struggle against fate. Scar from The Lion King killing Mufasa wasn't just about seizing power, it threw the entire circle of life out of balance. His rule didn't just bring ruin to Pride Lands, it forced Simba to grow. Without Scar, Simba stays in exile, clinging to his Hakuna Matata mindset. Scar doesn't just challenge Simba's strength, he challenges his idea of what it means to lead.
Oh, my friends.
Friends? I thought he said we were the enemy.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Let me tell you a short story. Imagine you're at a wedding, but it's no ordinary wedding. It's taking place on Mount Olympus. You can see gods who have gathered for the event, and everything is perfect. The finest food, the sweetest nectar, and the most dazzling decorations fill the scene, and everyone is invited. Well, almost everyone. The one guest who wasn't invited isn't exactly thrilled about being left out, so she has an idea. An idea that at first glance seems harmless. A golden apple inscribed with 3 simple words: to the fairest. She tosses the apple and it lands among the gods. A few curious glances turn to raised eyebrows, and then slowly but surely, smiles fade into suspicion. The murmurs grow, whispers turn to tension. Eyes narrow as the 3 of the most powerful goddesses eye the golden fruit. And just like that, a spark of chaos is born. And the one who threw the apple is none other than Eris, the Greek goddess of discord. While on the surface her act seems petty, it set into motion a series of events that led to the Trojan War, which became a major catalyst for growth, both in the narrative of mythology and in the characters involved. In a philosophical sense, the chaos that Eris introduced was necessary to bring about profound changes in the world of mortals and gods alike. Eris represented a necessary force. Without discord, there's no growth. Without chaos, there's no order. Villains serve that same role in storytelling. They upend the natural order, forcing the hero and the world around them to evolve. They're the reason things change.
Beneath this mask, there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask, there is an idea, Mr. Creedy. And ideas are bulletproof.
They say if your dreams don't scare you, you aren't dreaming big enough. I feel like Dutch van der Linde from Red Dead Redemption 2 took this saying to heart by setting a dream to have a free life that is not controlled by some government and where his gang can live on their own terms. And the thing is, his dream is not entirely wrong. It's beautiful in many ways. The world of the Wild West is changing, making outlaws like Dutch a dying breed. But somewhere along the way, that dream turns into something darker. You see, Dutch believes he's the hero of his story, but his paranoia, pride, and the obsession with control slowly consume him. The tragedy isn't just in his fall, it's in how close he comes to being the person he thinks he is. You see flashes of it, moments where you think he could still turn things around, but as the game goes on, you realize Dutch isn't the man you thought he was, and maybe neither is he. But this confused yet complex inner world is what makes Dutch such a fascinating villain. His character arc can be translated as a question of what principles you would give up just to fit in, and more importantly, for which ideals would you sacrifice anything for and rather die fighting.
We can't always fight nature, John. We can't fight change. Can't fight gravity. We can't fight nothing. My whole life, all I ever did was fight.
Then give up, Dutch.
But I can't give up, neither. I can't fight my own nature. That's a paradox, John. You see?
Then I have to shoot you.
When I'm gone, they'll just find another monster. They have to. Because they have to justify their wages.
There's also a weird parallel between Dutch and Gollum from Lord of the Rings. They might not look the same, and one of them is far more eloquent.
You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you.
But they are both completely and utterly consumed by a mysterious power. For Gollum it's the ring, and for Dutch it's the dream. With both of these characters, I hoped for their redemption, because there were moments, brief, heartbreaking moments, where I saw glimpses of who they used to be, and I hoped that they could break free. But they can't. They're too far gone, trapped by their obsession, becoming someone completely different. Almost like a reflection of what we fear becoming ourselves.
Loyalty, Arthur, it ain't. I had a goddamn plan!
A few years ago, I was driving in Greece after dinner. It was pitch black, and I was winding through these narrow, mountainous roads. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. Until suddenly, out of nowhere, a car came flying around a blind turn. There was no time to react, no way to prepare. And the feeling in that moment, that's what characters like Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men embody. He has no tragic backstory or a desire for power. He's a force of nature, a walking embodiment of death, a speeding car coming out of a blind turn. There's no right or wrong, there's only a chance.
What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The most you ever lost on a coin toss?
I don't know. I couldn't say.
Call it.
There's no morality in the coin flip. It's just randomness. How the universe is indifferent to human life. Or would you call it fate? Villains like Chigurh don't need complex motivations to terrify us. They represent something more primal. The chaos and unpredictability of life itself. No matter how much we try to impose order, no matter how much we plan or prepare, there are always forces that can tear everything apart in an instant. And that's why Chigurh is so terrifying. You can't reason with him, you can't appeal to his humanity, he's just inevitable.
Call it.
The coin don't have no say. It's just you.
I got here the same way the coin did.
And even after the villain is defeated by some hero, they don't really lose, do they? Their defeat isn't the end of the story. In Star Wars, the fall of Darth Vader or Palpatine doesn't magically heal the galaxy. No, the galaxy is fractured, haunted by the chaos and power vacuum the Empire left behind. In God of War, when Kratos kills Baldur, it doesn't just end a personal vendetta, it sets off a chain of events that leads to Ragnarok, the literal end of the world. Kratos wins the fight, but in doing so he triggers something much bigger.
The cycle ends here. Must be better than this.
The villain's legacy isn't just one of destruction, it's one of change. The world isn't the same because of them, and it never will be. When Joker is defeated, Gotham is left in chaos, darker than ever. Batman's victory doesn't restore balance, it forces him further into moral ambiguity. Villains essentially are like entropy. They are a measure of how much chaos and disorder exists in a system. Just as entropy pulls everything toward disorder, villains disrupt the balance of the world they inhabit. They introduce unpredictability, upend the status quo, and challenge the hero's sense of order. Without them, everything would stay stagnant, but with them we see the true test of what it means to maintain balance. And the more complex the villain, the more they embody this force of entropy. Not just mindless destruction, but a challenge to the very fabric of what the hero, and by extension society, believes is right. They push boundaries, often making us question if the systems they're disrupting deserve to even stay intact at all.
The only sensible way to live in this world is without rules. And tonight you're gonna break your one rule.
Without villains or without entropy, there's no growth, no evolution, just a lifeless status quo. Villains force change, even if it's through destruction. And by defeating them, the hero isn't just winning a battle, they're being dragged into a new reality, a world shaped by the villain's actions. That's why a hero's victory often feels hollow, because even in defeat, the villain has already changed everything.
君たちは一体何を基準に善と悪をより分けているんだろうね。
あなた、一体。
僕は人の魂の輝きが見たい。己の無力さを後悔し、絶望するがいい。
犯罪係数ゼロ、執行対象ではありません。トリガーをロックします。
So why are villains better than heroes? It's simple, really. Well, kinda. It's because they don't just react to the world around them, they shape it. Instead of being reactive little robots, they are proactive instead. They set the stage, they set the stakes, and most importantly, they are the ones who make us actually care. Whether they're forces of nature like Anton Chigurh, or complex broken characters like Dutch, villains force us to confront uncomfortable truths. About the world, about the systems we trust, and most importantly, about ourselves.
All those.
But villains give us reflection, and force us to ask, what would we do in their place? Maybe that's why we're drawn to villains, not because we admire their actions, but because they embody the tension between who we are now and who we could become. At the end of the day, we don't remember villains because they're bad, or for the same reasons as why we remember heroes. Villains are not clean, pretty, or shredded. No. Villains reveal the true depth of what it means to be human. And in a way, they remind us that change, whether we like it or not, is inevitable.
Beautiful, aren't they? Yet, up there, on the surface, no one even knows they exist.
They're monsters.
There's a monster inside all of us.
And speaking of change, I made a video exploring if you can learn anything from a video game. You can check it out next. And as always, thank you for watching.
Human emotions are a gift from our animal ancestors. Cruelty is a gift humanity has given itself.